Thanks to all of you. I know this is one of our most exciting marquee events. I'm excited to get to talk to you, Mr. Stiglitz, about your book, The Euro, How a Common Currency Threatens the Future of Europe. And honestly, Europe is in the headlines a lot right now, not just because of currency crisis, recovery from a debt crisis, but now you have the migrant crisis, an outgrowth of the conflict in Syria, these growth of more protectionist, nationalist parties. They have a lot of strains. We're not even talking about Brexit there. But for you, when you look at Europe, the biggest fissure and problem you see is the monetary union itself. Are you predicting its demise, or are you trying to save it?
Both. I really am trying to save it. This idea of bringing all the countries to Europe together, which is sometimes called the European project, was a really visionary idea. They'd had two world wars. They didn't want to repeat that. But they made a big mistake. They put the cart before the horse. They thought that forming a single currency would move them further along the way, and they pushed this kind of economic integration, I think, before they had created the political institutions that would make it work, and before there was enough solidarity to create those political institutions. And the consequences, I think, have been very, very serious. I mean, the result, it was supposed to bring prosperity, and that prosperity was supposed to bring solidarity, to bring them closer together.
Prosperity to some on the periphery for a while, right? And then it changed with the debt crisis.
That's right. But it was even then, it was a false prosperity, because the countries in the periphery, countries like Greece and Spain, were growing well because of a kind of irrationality on the markets. The markets thought that if you had eliminated exchange rate risk, the risk that the currencies would vary in price, you had eliminated effectively all risk. But you hadn't. You still had the risk that the country could have a recession or a depression. In fact, those risks were increased. So what happened was the interest rates in those countries came way down. You know, bonds in Greece were selling for minuscule amounts above those in Germany. So you had the money flowing in irrationally, causing, in part, prices actually to rise in the peripheral countries. And so the ability of these countries to export, to be competitive was decreased. And this was where the fixed exchange rate really came in. The 2008 crisis meant all of a sudden all that flow of money coming in stopped. They had to adjust. But the normal way of adjusting is an adjustment in exchange rate, an adjustment in differential interest rates. Right. That was taken away.
Because they didn't have that control over their sovereign state any longer.
That's right. And then to make things worse, not only had they taken away the Eurozone when they designed it, taken away these instruments of adjustment, they had tied the hands of each country even more, because they said they couldn't have a deficit of more than 3%. And so that meant they couldn't use exchange rate policy, they couldn't use interest rate policy, they couldn't use fiscal policy. And so they were what we call in America a pickle. And that led to recessions and depressions.
And you're predicting that you're really going to see that for the decade ahead, a lost generation, or at least a lost decade.
Already, I mean, the problem started in 2008. We're 2016. No one sees an easy entry out of this. The gap between where they would have been and where they are is growing larger and larger. You know, we're talking about trillions of dollars lost. The youth unemployment in countries like Spain, 50%, Greece, 60%. You know, our students sometimes complain about the difficulty getting a job, but can you imagine year after year, now 8 years, where the youth unemployment rate is more than 50%. You know, and that's after students leave the
Right.
country. And so you have some of the more talented people leaving the country, and so you're getting a howling out. So the growth in these countries is not going to ever catch up, probably.
So then UK, not part of the monetary union, but part of the EU, do they have it right? I mean, is Brexit ultimately the acknowledgement of some of these flaws that you're diagnosing and you're spotting here?
Yes, I mean, as you said, UK was not part of the Eurozone, and so it didn't suffer from the worst of what was going on. But it did suffer in a couple ways. One was, you know, the migration crisis is all in the news. One of the problems is that because of the euro, so many of the countries in Europe have high unemployment, and when there's high unemployment, they don't want to have more migrants, and the migrants don't want to go to a country where there's a 20% unemployment rate.
And this has really become, in many ways, Germany's problem for the past few years. And that's one of the things I thought was interesting here, because often Angela Merkel is hailed as maybe the only adult in the room, diplomats would say, and certainly Germany's the economic engine of Europe. But you actually think Germany's not approaching this right and creating more problems for those who are in the zone.
They've really created the problem because they've forced a set of economic policies, austerity, a particular kind of structural reform in the individual countries, and they've resisted the reform in the Eurozone, the rules of the Eurozone, which are at the heart of the problem. You know, the thesis of the book is Europe, the Eurozone isn't working, it was flawed at birth, and it was the rules that created it. A central bank that focuses just on inflation, not on unemployment, not on economic growth, these budgetary constraints, the idea that if you just kept debt and deficits relative to GDP low, the countries would converge together and all would be well. Mm-hmm. It hasn't happened. It's been, you know, I thought it was bad economics in 1992 when they started, but it's been proven really bad economics in the subsequent years where the countries have diverged. And I think one way of thinking about it was the euro started, as I say, in 1992. It was a particular moment in history. It was after the Latin American crisis, after the fall of the Iron Curtain and Berlin Wall. We thought that that meant the market system was perfect. Mm-hmm. Really, the lesson was that the communist system was terrible. And we hadn't seen the East Asian crisis, where in the East Asian crisis, you had countries that had no inflation, big surpluses, or certainly no low deficits, and yet you had a crisis. And so the ideas that went into that 92 agreement of the design were based on that historical experience that they had. I sometimes wonder, you know, what would have happened if they had designed the euro after the 97 East Asia crisis or after the 2008 global financial crisis, where you saw that markets on their own don't work very well.
Well, and you argue that there should be more of a sort of bespoke currency, a tailored currency, but others would look at that and say, well, why shouldn't Greece and why shouldn't Ireland and why shouldn't these countries who didn't manage their own internal finances well enough be forced to live by the same rules as those who have, right? That's what the argument has been for the current course of action.
Yeah. So I mean, this idea of rules and playing by the rules is been clearly part of the debate. The idea that, you know, it's Greece's fault, it was Greece misbehaved and needs to be punished, and you need to have rules.
And you advised the Greek government, didn't you?
Yeah, yes, I did. So, but not to have these big deficits. I never said that.
No.
No,
On the back.
but so I advised them on the good parts of what they did. The fact is, if it were only Greece, there wouldn't be a euro crisis. You know, Greece is 10 million people, small percentage of the eurozone, but it's not just Greece. It's country after country. And when you have so many crises, you have to realize that there's a systemic problem. It's not the individual country. Many of these countries were growing faster than the European average before 2008, before 2000, before the euro. So it's clearly not, it wasn't that suddenly these countries forgot how to grow, or that these countries, you know, what was the change? The change was the euro. And the fact that the euro made it so difficult for them to adjust to a shock like the global financial crisis. So that in a nutshell is why, you know, when you have the wrong rules, you have to change the rules, not force people to live by rules that are clearly flawed. So take Ireland and Spain, for instance. They actually had a surplus before the crisis. The crisis created their deficits, not the other way around. And Germany has consistently not understood this. So they've insisted on doubling down on an economic theory that is fundamentally flawed. And the result of that is years and years of recession and depression.
You don't see Ireland as a success story now and having
It's
clawed their
doing
way
a
back
little
to
better,
growth?
but it's still just barely getting back to where it was in 2008. It's still a lost 8 years. And some of what they are doing, some of their success, is based on what I would call bad behavior. What they're doing is trying to steal jobs from other countries by unfair tax provisions.
Now you're talking about something people in the U.S. may have followed in terms of the Apple debate, right? Well, which some would argue isn't necessarily just about more favorable tax rate, but perhaps a tax credit, that there are incentives that individual countries are offering to bring in business, and the rest of the European Commission is not so happy about that.
No, that's not, with the European Commission, you have a group of countries trying to live together, and it goes back to a kind of set of rules.
Right.
And they say there are certain rules that you have to live by. Among the rules, you can't have state aid for one company that's not available for other companies that are in similar situation. Okay, so you can't have narrowly defined state aid, because if you do, then you'll have this tax competition where it'll be a race to the bottom.
Right. And you agree with that rule, or you disagree with that rule?
In general, I think this basic principle of trying to avoid a race to the bottom is very important. If you don't have it, you won't be able to function. You won't, the race to the bottom will be no tax revenue, and you can't provide basic public services.
So they did get it right on one front.
So they did get it right. That's an EU rule, not a Eurozone rule. So that was an important rule. And what Ireland did was basically violate that with a secret agreement with Apple that basically lowered its tax rate to something like 0.5 of 1% or 0.005 of 1%. And when you have tax rates that are that low, they're not paying their fair share. That's tax avoidance, if not tax evasion. And what they did is very simple. They pretended that all of the profits they were making all over Europe were created by a few people working in Ireland. And then they pretended that all the profits in Ireland could be attributed to a holding company in cyberspace that had essentially no tax. And what the European Commission said is, we're not going to get into your you're misreporting the source of your income. What we're going to say is, if you claim this is Irish income, and they said, we're suspicious, and they should be. If you claim it's Irish income, you as Ireland have to levy a 12.5% tax. And that's all they said. Now, the interesting thing, there's so many interesting global aspects of this, that it was a secret deal that no one knew about. That Apple had no incentive to make it known, Ireland, and when you have secret tax deals, it's really bad for society.
Well, the U.S. Treasury didn't like how the European Commission handled this, though, and
but
Ireland's appealing it.
But I think our Treasury was totally wrong.
Really?
So the
If anyone from Treasury is in
the interesting thing about this was the way it came out was it was the U.S. government that alerted the European Commission that Apple was cheating. So after the U.S. government alerted them that Apple was cheating, they started looking into it. And the interesting thing right now is Apple and Ireland refuse to let the decision be public because they're so embarrassed. And the fact is that if they made available to all the European countries, all American companies operating in Europe, the same deal that they did with Apple, Europe's tax revenues would be so eroded that there would be really a real problem.
Well, I want to ask you then, because you are advising the Hillary Clinton campaign. If she becomes president on day one, she's going to have a lot on her desk. When it comes to this kind of issue, what would you advise her to do in her White House, her Treasury Department?
Well, I think the tax law that allows, that almost encourages firms to keep their money abroad will change. I think the notion that you're only taxed when you bring your money back is an incentive for people to look around for these kind of tax havens.
Right.
So we have something to blame for creating the incentives that lead for this opportunity for Apple to basically avoid paying taxes.
You would argue then for a lower corporate tax rate in the United States?
Well, I think that the actual tax rate that corporations pay is very, very low. Our legislative rate is very high. I would probably argue that let's actually enforce the tax code, and if we enforce it, we can get the same revenue with a lower tax rate. So let's get rid of the exceptions, let's get rid of this special provision, and yes, let's have a lower tax rate, but really enforce it rather than having these massive loopholes.
To bring us back to Europe writ large, I mean, if Hillary Clinton wins on day one, what's her first conversation with Angela Merkel as you look at some of the chancellor's decisions and you've been critical of them?
Well, I think this is where actually our Treasury has been playing a positive role. It's been repeatedly emphasizing to Europe that it is bad for the global economy if the Eurozone doesn't function well. And that was one of the reasons I wrote the book. I mean, if the largest economy, or arguably the second largest economy in the world, the Eurozone and Europe, is not functioning well, the global economy is not going to function well. And it can't function well with the kind of austerity that Germany has been insisting on.
But you don't think they're going to reform themselves, that this is going to be just sort of muddling through?
I think that's the problem. There are a set of reforms that would make the Eurozone work. I mean, after all, we have a single currency that works among 50 diverse states, but we have things like common deposit insurance, all the banks. We have what we call a national resolution of deposit of a bank that is a problem. If Washington State had to bail out Washington Mutual, Washington State would be in trouble now. So they need a Eurozone-wide way of resolving.
There aren't the insurance policies within the broader zone that you have.
That's right.
Here
So
in the
they
United
have
States.
to have some policies. They don't have to go the degree of federalism the United States has, but they have to have more Europe than they have today. So that would be the best solution. Unfortunately, what I see is the political solidarity, the political will to do that just isn't there. There's too much resistance.
Yeah.
And so as I see it, the choice is either between more Europe or less Europe.
And you don't think something as shocking to the entire European project as Brexit, which has sort of caused people to question everything, You don't think that's enough to force people to make these decisions that you're suggesting, go to a flexible currency or reform some of these broader
No,
trade
they had a
issues?
meeting in Bratislava
Yeah,
just
a week ago.
and I talked to some of the people coming back from Bratislava, and they make a good front. They say they had a good conversation. They're making advances and all
It
of
was
that.
constructive.
It was
Usually
very
that's the word, right?
Exactly. So they've devised all kinds of things to say that, all kinds of ways to say that nothing actually happened.
Yes. I'm a journalist. We're familiar with getting that from institutions, right?
That's right. So,
But you think they're really hurting themselves ultimately. They're creating their own demise by not making some of these decisions.
I think that's right. I mean, I think a lot of these ideas that I put forward in my book are being discussed. But from what I hear from at least many of the people that I would have thought would be, you might say, more charitable, is they are thinking, each country is thinking about the impact of each decision on their budget, on their country. So they're not asking what would be good for the Eurozone.
Right.
They're asking, if we do this, will we wind up having to write a check for some other benefit of some other country? And to some extent, that reflects where the citizens of many of these countries are today.
Yeah.
That is, I'm not saying that there's a kind of selfishness. In Germany, they actually have a way of articulating this. They say, we are not a transfer union, which means we are not a union. If people in New York said, we won't subsidize Alabama, or all that, then the whole country would be on a very different economic basis. The wealthier states in the United States are subsidizing the rest to a significant extent, but it's not part of our debate in the way that it has become a very much part of the debate, especially in Germany.
So in your projection, when you discuss, okay, here's what you could do, this idea of a flexible currency, here's what you could do to keep the union together, to keep things chugging along and tailor them more to the individual countries, who is the person who comes to the fore who triggers that, who argues that, who makes that case? If you're saying it's becoming less and less of a union, more and more of the borders are becoming more prominent and more domestically focused, how do you trigger that?
So, I mean,
Is this the next 2 years of Brexit negotiations and forcing people to be examining their own finances more or how they do things?
I think the Brexit discussions will be very much like the discussions that we've been hearing, which are each country looking very much how it's affecting them individually, not how it's going to be affecting as much the future of Europe. There's one more aspect of the Brexit discussion that I find very disturbing. Juncker, who is the head of the European Commission, said, and many other people have said something similar, we have to really give the UK a very bad deal, because if we don't, other countries will want to leave.
Right.
And I thought that was so strange. It wasn't that we have, I would have thought he would have said, we haven't communicated to the citizens of the countries the benefits of being in the EU. We have to work harder to make sure that there are more benefits, and that we have to work harder to make sure they understand those benefits. He didn't mention anything about the benefits.
Well,
it was really, let's force them to stay together,
right?
And under the threat that if you're not together, things will be worse than they are today.
And when you ask EU officials about that, they say, well, that's not our job, and we've decided it is not our job to sell ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that illustrates the very top-down nature of the EU. It wasn't a grassroots, let's all get together. And it was never a very democratic movement, you might say. And in fact, as I point in the book, most of the referendum, when they put the EU, its provisions, the euro, to a vote, the citizens have rejected it. So, for instance, Sweden had a vote on whether to join the euro. And they said, no, no way. Norway had a vote on whether to join the EU. And they said, no. In the case of Ireland, they had a referendum that came out, the answer was no, and the government said, we'll have another referendum until you vote yes. So they did vote yes on the next referendum. So that's, if you keep holding referendum, but
You seem more pessimistic about the future of the Eurozone in Europe right now than you do believing that they're going to take the advice that you lay out here, though.
I think that's right. I mean, I think there is a way forward where it could work together. But what I've been hearing, and as I say, it's gotten worse, I think, since Brexit, when I would have thought that would be a wake-up call and
Self-reflection.
and self-reflection and saying, how do we make it more work better and more convince people more? It's actually gone in the other direction. And right now, there are a number of threats that are quite imminent to the future of the Eurozone. I mean, for instance, the Economist Intelligence Unit has said, 2015, just a year ago, Europe thought it had solved the Greek crisis. They're now putting a 60% probability that Greece will be out of the Eurozone within 3 years.
Wow.
So that gives you a flavor that they have not solved the Greek crisis, the Greek problem. Depression has gotten worse. And then the next set of problems, like in Italy, are really right on the horizon.
Thank you very much for laying all of this out. So, a little pessimistic, but thank you.